Orca, and and Dylan into Ginsberg, and also Whitman, and all of that sort of thing. And what for you? How did you get into sort of, what was your entry point?
Well, I can absolutely picture being in the junior high school library and knowing that I had come for poetry books, and there was one shelf, and I must have been standing in front of it, and there was one woman, Sylvia Plath, no other women in the whole of that library that I recall in poetry, and I know that I read Plath's poems at a young age, and then I read The Bell Jar, and like many other sort of teenage girls, I was totally enchanted with this kind of romantic, passionate, eloquent, brilliant writer. And I have a funny story in which I had read, I can't remember if it's part of The Bell Jar or if it's in one of the biographies, but I had read that Plath submitted to 17 magazine like 100 times before they finally took a poem. And so I was like, well, I better get started. It's going to take a long time. And so I sent them, some poems, and they took the first one.
Oh, wow.
Well, except they never ran it. They paid me like $15, and I told my teacher, and she told the town, and the town put me in the paper, and it was all very exciting. But they never actually published it, and I sort of realized like they're just manipulating us all. Like we can't complain, but like, but I did feel sort of like, okay, Sylvia, here I come. I'm my first try. The last line of that poem, it was about walking in the rain with my boyfriend, and knowing that things are not great, and the last line of that poem was, "Drenched to the heart were we." Although the rest of it was actually kind of like straightforward language that you might actually speak, but I had that melodramatic ending.
Do you ever like look back on early stuff and just kind of cringe?
Well, I mean, the little, like early, like junior high, element, those things that, I have a lot of really sentimental stuff that my mother saved. Oh. She pulls it out every now and then. I wrote poems for the clothing drive in 6th grade, where we were trying to get people to, bring in clothes. And I mean, they were very moralistic, and I don't really, I don't cringe exactly. I wish I had been a more, I don't know, more of a prodigy. But I was not. I was totally pretty plainly melodramatic. And I look back at, this is sort of related to what we were talking about earlier. I look back at the early work I did in college, and that work I feel surprised by and sort of interested in. And I register that I was taught to write what I knew, and that there were big values in that. Like I was writing all these kind of all over the place things. I was taking lines out of the newspaper about a scientist who made some discovery that I don't remember now what it was, but I was writing about that guy. And my teacher was like, "This is nice, but why do you care?" And I got more good feedback from the stuff that was closer to home. And at a certain point I looked back and I thought, like, there's something off about this. I wish I had been encouraged to do better at the rangier things rather than to take what seems in a certain way like the easier path towards doing better, which was to stay very close to home and what I knew and what my experiences were, because I felt that it was less ambitious that. And I use that in my teaching to a degree, so that I don't want to foreclose the impulses that people have that are the most wide-ranging or the most experimental, or just testing what you can do. And that's it.
Now, so where did you grow up?
I grew up in New Jersey, in a suburb of New York City.
You have like no accent.
No, I can do it.
Yeah.
Well, although I sort of lost it when my kids were in high school. We developed a habit of talking to each other in British accents because my son had watched this British TV show, and and now my New Jersey is sort of spoiled by a bad British overtones. Yeah.
So what did you find? Did you find place influencing your writing at all?
I think that place is always a presence for me because I'm a walker, and so wherever I am, I tend to be. And especially if I'm working, I'm always walking. And so then I end up looking around and, it's the, landing on something that I see that triggers. I feel like with every poem, you kind of, you sort of walk around the world knowing that you have something to say. And you might even know, like, I need to write about this thing that happened or this subject matter that I'm interested in. But by itself, usually it's not enough. And generally speaking, you come into contact with some other thing and somehow those two things kind of bump up against each other. And then now you've got some energy, you've got a poem, you've got, I don't know if sometimes it's conflict, sometimes it's surprise, but it's two sticks to make a fire. And so I think that, when I was working on my first book, Annus Mirabilis, I was doing all this reading and research on the lives of Newton and Leibniz and other mathematicians. So I felt I had this wealth of stuff that seemed to me like it could be worthy of being a poem. But usually what would happen is I would see something in the day and that would trigger an image or a sentence, and then I would somehow find a way of bringing the research and the ideas that I had for the kind of project of writing about those two guys together with whatever had happened that gave me this other thing.
So I'm curious. There's a bunch of things that I want to talk about, but just generally speaking, for you, what is the process of putting a collection like Hold Sway together? I mean, what do you? It sounds like, and that first collection sounds very interesting to me. So I'm gonna have to go back and read it. But do you start with? Well, okay. So let me put it this way: when do you decide that it's time to put a collection together? And at that point, what is sort of your process, and how can that? What sort of even time frame, I guess, do you look at? Because in the poems in Hold Sway seem to span a number of years, and so yeah. I mean, when do you decide? Do you decide that you have enough, and then you're ready to shape a collection, or do you start? I don't know. It's a very very kind of nebulous idea to me of putting a collection of poems together. Well,
I think, I think people do it in really different ways. I think this is my third book, and in each case, I imagined myself to be mostly, just living day to day, writing the poems that occurred to me. And in the case of Annus Mirabilis, I did do this research, and I had this kind of pool of stuff that was about the mathematicians. In the case of Wreck Me, I was often writing about my dad was waiting to get a double lung transplant, which he eventually got. And I was doing a ton of reading about and going to some educational programs at the hospital where he received it. And so I was sort of the science of and the fact of that, like, incredibly violent intervention was definitely a part of my head. And I knew I was sort of writing about that coming phenomenon of his receiving the transplant. And then in Hold Sway, I was maybe a little bit less. There's not one obvious sort of territory of like research that I was doing, but I had found in the poem Hold, which is kind of at the center and the anchor of this collection, that I wanted to have a way of talking about some of the things that I sort of, that can get lost from you, larger things about, what's happening in the world, and yet maintain the intimacy that I think I have sort of developed in the other poems that are in the other books. I wanted that grand stuff about the environment and the menace in kind of contemporary life. And I also wanted the same intimacy and proximity that I hope I get in poems that are more sort of personal. And when I wrote Hold, that really broke almost a 10-year sense of frustration, that even though I wanted to find that combined territory, I had really not. I had written poems that I was okay about, that fell, to one side or the other, but to have both things at once, I just didn't feel I had done it. And when I wrote Hold, I felt like, okay, like there is a way to think and think in large ways about what's happening in the world, and at the same time, to be a very human individual and not wagging your finger at anybody. And so that galvanized my sense that I could write, that what I was working on could be a book. And most of the poems in here date from after that poem was written, and some of the ones that stayed that I already had, they are older, but the bulk of this work really came after the fall of 2015 when I figured that poem out.
I wanted to talk about that as far as, because, I definitely fall on the liberal, we're killing the planet spectrum. And it is really difficult to artfully speak to any of that.
Right. You're talking to people who already know.
Yeah,
usually,
you're usually preaching to the choir, or somebody whose mind you're never going to change.
Right.
I was out last night on Roosevelt and walking past the Flat Worlders, and it just shaking my head. But again, that's the sort of thing. So at some point, you have to decide how much, when you write about that sort of thing, how do you make it something where you aren't just preaching to the choir, where you aren't just shouting into the void, and I feel like you did that very successfully. This is something where as I was reading, I was thinking, in the wrong hands, this would just sound preachy. But no, you did just a wonderful job taking things like talking about garbage and waste and how we're killing the planet, and making it personal and relatable, and which my head is very much off to you in that. What was I going to say? I kind of want to come back to Hold Sway again at the end, because if you don't mind, there are a couple of particular poems that I would love it if you would be willing to read them.
Sure.
So I do want to talk about your work with Four-Way as well, because I have a sort of natural curiosity about that because of Hoot and Waddle and what I do with that. How did you come to be involved on the other side of things, on the publishing aspect of things?
I was working at Washington University in St. Louis in a non-academic department called the International Writers Center that had been founded by William H. Gass, the novelist. And it was a small thing. It was Bill and Lauren Cuoco was the associate director, and then I was the program coordinator, and then we had some student interns. And our job was to host a reading series, and we did conferences every year on subjects like the writer in politics, the writer in religion. The Dual Muse was a conference about writers who make visual art and visual artists who have written novels or poetry. And we had, a museum exhibit, and we had all these things. So anyway, I worked there. And through WashU, I was given some very intense training in grant writing to support the work of the center. And I was at the alumni conference of Warren Wilson, where I got my MFA. And Martha Rhodes gave a talk to it was like the 15th anniversary of the program. And Martha had just begun to found this new press, Four-Way Books. And she gave a talk to those of us who were gathered about what was happening. And it was just a kind of, we're doing this kind of a talk. And maybe she was hoping for financial support. I don't really remember the details of